almost nobody lives out the philosophy that it's all an illusion, it's all a matter of feelings, it's all a fantasy and a fairy tale. They may say it, they may write books about it, but when you treat them according to their own philosophy, it turns out that they don't really believe it. All right, if there is such a thing as good and evil, explain it. Why? If there is such a thing as moral obligation, if you are really obligated to do good and not evil, why? What is there behind the moral law? You see, there are facts about how things and people behave, and there are also moral facts, if this analysis is correct, about how people ought to behave, but often don't. What's behind these moral facts, which we often call a moral law? Mustn't there be a will behind a moral law? We feel as if we're being commanded, but we don't see anybody commanding us. Well, this used to be a very popular argument until, maybe 100 or 200 years ago, when moral objectivism, the notion that morality is objective, that moral laws are real and not just made up, became much less popular. So Cardinal Newman, back in the 19th century, formulated a version of the moral argument that should appeal even to the moral subjectivist, even to the person who says that moral rules are only things we make up, nothing objective about them. All right? Say to such a subjectivist, do you admire somebody who violates their own conscience? And they'll always say no. I admire somebody who violates the Ten Commandments, maybe, or the Quran, or the laws of the state, or any objective laws, but we got to be true to ourselves. Oh. So somebody who's a deliberately lying, hypocritical violator of their own conscience, that's not good. No. You got to be true to yourself. Why? Where does conscience get its authority from? Where did conscience come from? Is it just one of these results of mindless evolution? The brain just happens to be wired that way? Why bow down in sheepish obedience to the accidental fact that this is the way your brain happened to be wired? Why not wire it better? Or if it's just the voice of society, as Freud thinks, if conscience is just the superego unconsciously mirroring what other people want you to do, why bow down to them as if you're God? Or if it's just the training that you got from your parents, well, your parents are not infallible. But everybody, even the moral subjectivist, thinks we ought to treat conscience as if it were God's prophet. But if it isn't, why should you? But it can't be God's prophet unless there's a God. Dostoevsky's version of the argument is extremely simple. If God does not exist, then everything is permissible. When I cover Nietzsche in my classes at Boston College, I try to get across his very radical challenge to my students. And one of them is, why is there truth? Why bother with truth? Why truth? Why not rather the lie, he says. And they can't answer that. But there's another one about morality. Why be good? Why not be evil? Why not go beyond good and evil? If there is no God, why not be evil? And nobody has ever answered that question. It's an astonishingly simple question. Why not be bad? Well, because we'll catch you. No, you won't. I'm cleverer than you are. Well, we'll hate you. So what? I hate you too. I don't care if you hate me. Oh, because it's not conducive to the good of society. I know. I don't give a damn about society. Why should I? The thoroughgoing immoralist, it's very difficult to refute him if there's no God. I've got two arguments left. The argument from desire, I think, is my favorite argument because the premise is fascinating. The premise is that everybody's unhappy. Everybody desires something they can't have. Robert Browning said, a man's reach must exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Think of the happiest time you ever had in your life. Think of the most exalted music you ever heard, or the most exalted lovemaking you ever participated in, or the most beautiful sight you ever saw, or the most wonderful intuition you ever had. Didn't it say to you, I'm just an appetizer. There's more where I come from. And haven't you looked for that more all your life? And you've never quite found it. C.S. Lewis puts it in these haunting words. All your life, an unattainable ecstasy has hovered just beyond the grasp of your consciousness. The day is coming when, after death, you will awaken to find either that beyond all hope you have it, or else it was within your grasp and you have lost it forever. The thing we desire is not to be identified with these wonderful earthly experiences that only provoke it, which are only its appetizers. In fact, that becomes clearer the happier you are. It's unhappy people who can easily be victimized by the superstition of if only. If only I had $1 million and a Learjet and a new mistress every day, I'd be happy. Well, no. Billions of people have tried that experiment. It's never worked. Not once. Not once. And yet we keep putting that car on the road hoping it'll go. To put the argument into a logical form. Premise number one, there is in the human heart a desire for something which nobody ever gets in this world. Something which can't even be imagined. Call it heaven. All right, describe heaven. Write about it. Nobody has ever written a good fiction about heaven. I don't want to live in any of your heavens or in mine. They'd be boring. I want never to be bored forever. I can't imagine that, but I want it. So we all want something we have never experienced and we can't even imagine. Premise number two. If you look at all human desires, you can classify them into two categories, natural and innate. The natural desires come from human nature. Natural and unnatural. The unnatural desires come from outside, from society, from advertising. I want to fly through the air like Superman. I want to go to the land of Oz. I want a World Series championship for the Boston Red Sox. These things are impossible. They will never happen. They don't exist. But I still desire them. Why? Because somebody has provoked me to desire them. But not everybody desires to fly through the air like Superman or go to the land of Oz or win a World Series. Any desire that's in everybody is innate. Desire for food, for drink, for sleep, for sex, for knowledge, for society. And there's always a corresponding state of deprivation for all natural desires. There's no such thing as Ozlessness or Supermanlessness, but there is such a thing as sleeplessness or sexlessness or knowledgelessness. It's called ignorance. It would be very, very strange indeed if, upon visiting some other planet, we found some creatures that had a passionate desire for food, but they didn't have stomachs. Or a race of creatures with only one sex who were constantly falling in love with a non-existent second sex. Couldn't be imagined. All right, so every innate desire corresponds to something real. You might not get it. You might die of starvation, but if you're hungry, there's food. Right? Put the two premises together. We all want something that can't be had in this world. Anything we all want that is a natural desire exists. Therefore, there exists something that can't be had in this world. There is another world. I don't know how you can get out of that argument. I don't know why you'd want to. Final argument from one of the most complete minds that ever existed, St. Augustine, who had both an incredible intellect and an incredible heart. Medieval statuary always pictured him with a Bible in one hand and a burning heart in the other hand. I know of no one who had simultaneously a more brilliant head and a more passionate heart. I call this the existential argument. Let's begin with Augustine's definition of man. Man, for Augustine, is a living tragedy. Everybody is a living tragedy. Not only are there specifically tragic people like King Lear or Hamlet or Antigone, but all of us, necessarily, inevitably, into the human condition, there is the following tragedy. Either your life is happy or it isn't. If your life is happy, you don't want to die, but you have to die. And the happier your life is, the more tragic death is. If your life is miserable, death isn't so bad. So life is miserable either way. But more seriously, I mean, that is a serious argument, but more substantively, no man is an island. We need a world. We are not our own world. We need a home to make us happy. Now, there's a lot of things in nature that make us happy. There's magnificent things in nature. We're made happy by sunsets and stars and storms. But not completely. We feel like orphans, like displaced persons, like wanderers. We're pilgrims. We're looking for something better. We're trying to make the world better all the time. Maybe we're succeeding, maybe not. I sort of think we're not, because we keep taking vacations in, quote, unspoiled places. Well, why do we prefer to live in spoiled places? Anyway, the world, though very beautiful, isn't enough. It doesn't fulfill us. It also thwarts us. It gives us pleasure, but it gives us pain. It gives us life, but it gives us death. If we ask nature, are you in favor of life or death? How many things have you brought into existence? How many things have you given life to? And it'll give a number, trillions and trillions. Okay, and how many have you killed, or are you in process of killing? And it'll give you a number, exactly the same number. In other words, nature is like Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. Frankly, my dear, I just don't give a damn. We do. We prefer life to death. We prefer beauty to ugliness. We prefer health to disease. Nature doesn't. Nature, says Augustine, is like a great river. On this river, everything exists. Plants and animals and arts and cultures and civilizations and people. And the river gives all this great stuff to us, and then it takes all this great stuff from us. It's not enough. All right, if we can't find our personal fulfillment, existential fulfillment in nature, what about human society? That's higher. Greater joys come from human love than from anything else. You'd rather be in love in the South Bronx than divorced in Hawaii. Is that enough? The world makes your body sort of happy. Human society makes your soul very happy, but it also makes it very unhappy. What are the biggest pains in your life? Your relatives, your family, your friends. The source of your greatest pains as well as your greatest happiness. People disappoint us. They fight wars, little ones and big ones. Betrayal, divorce, suicide, injustice, sin. Okay, we want more than that. The Stoics and the Buddhists say, yes, this is the correct analysis. Nature cannot fulfill us, society cannot fulfill us, but we find within ourselves something that fulfills ourselves. New Age people say that too. You can escape into the self. You find beauty, truth, and goodness within. You find the God within. No, you don't. You find the love of God within. You find the love of beauty, truth, and goodness within. But you also find the lack of it, the yearning for it. Romeo loves Juliet. That doesn't mean Romeo is Juliet. Even the Hindu mystic says, I don't want to be sugar, I want to taste sugar. Therefore, I don't want to be God, I want to taste God. But it seems we can't taste God. Obviously, the only answer that's going to fulfill the human heart is God. The only thing big enough to fit this infinite Grand Canyon in our souls is an infinite being. But, to quote the punchline from the classic New England joke, you can't get there from here. Not only you can't get there from here, we betray God. We are not good, we are evil. We are not true, we are false. We are not beautiful, we are ugly. We are a living koan puzzle. We must have God, we can't have God. We're homing pigeons for God. We're iron filings and God's the magnet. If there's no God, our deepest hopes are thwarted. So there is a God, yeah, but you can't get there. There's ignorance, there's weakness, there's sin. The worst barrier to our fulfillment is not the pains that come from nature or the injustices that come from human society. The biggest barrier is ourselves. And if you don't know that, well, then you're even more foolish. There's only two kinds of people in the world, Socrates thought: fools who think that they're wise and the wise who know that they're fools. And Jesus said the equivalent of there's only two kinds of people in the world, saints who know that they're sinners and sinners who think that they're saints. In other words, we're sinners. It's an unpopular word. We're wicked. Love that word. I got 4 kids. One of my daughters is verbally handicapped, and she said the wisest thing any of my kids ever said. She was about 5 or 6. She was in a group that did Saturday enrichments, and the kindergarten teacher took them around, and I was the chauffeur. And there was one of the 6 kids or so that was a real terror. Her name was Emily. She used to poke people's eyes out and pull their hair and whatnot when the teacher wasn't looking. And the teacher was one of these nice psychologists that kept saying, Emily, that's not what we do here. That's not appropriate behavior. Finally, after Emily had pulled somebody's hair, and the teacher turned to them, her and said, Emily, that's not appropriate. My daughter said, Teacher, why don't you tell her she's wicked? Want to meet Emily? Look in the mirror. Do you really think it would be great to meet God right now, tonight, in 2 minutes, without any hiding, without any excuses? Wouldn't that be great? If you say yes, then you're either a very great saint or a very great fool. So our only hope is not merely that God exists, and not even merely that we can meet him, but that there's some sort of mediation, some sort of way, some sort of path. But that can happen only if, astonishingly, and there's absolutely no proof of this, God cares about us. Imagine you have an ant farm, and the ants rebel against you. Wouldn't you have to be a little crazy to become an ant and go down into that ant farm and die for those ants in order to save them? Well, the difference between us and an ant is not as great as the difference between us and God. And at the heart of Christianity is the claim that this is the kind of God we've got. A God who is so crazy in love with us that that's what he did. That's our only hope. That the author entered his own story and became one of us. So instead of God just sitting around wondering whether we're going to prove his existence, he takes the initiative, and he's not out there somewhere wondering whether you're going to get to him. He's the very thing that's inspiring you right now at the center of your heart to move towards him. I love Augustine's definition of God. God, he says, is that which is infinitely closer to ourselves than we can ever be to ourselves. I hope I've given you some provocative things to ask questions about. I am always amazed at how patient audiences are to sit through boring lectures. Lectures are always boring, in order to get to the interesting question and answer sessions. Your purgatory is over. Enter heaven. Questions, please.
My question is the following. Accepting the whole of the Christian revelation and looking at the writings within the Christian tradition, one of the perhaps the most disturbing thesis that I've ever seen offered is that of the fewness of the saved. The notion that...
That's an easy one to explain.
Okay, good, because...
Jesus is not, when he says few are saved and many are not, he's not speaking it as a statistician. He's speaking as a father. If I had 12 kids and one of them died, that would be 1 too many, and 11 is 11 too few. 1 too few.
Good.
We have no idea what the comparative population statistics of heaven and hell are. We have no idea. Period.
Professor, I went to Boston College, but I'm too old to have had you as a teacher. What are some of the profound things you've learned from your students?
Wait a minute. This is a metaphysical impossibility. You're younger than I am, and yet you're too old to have had me as a teacher. But, all right. What are the things I've learned from my students? How stupid I am. How teachers are like farmers. They throw seeds out onto the soil, and this little seed over here suddenly grows up as a plant years later. Good grief, I never even knew I said that. How frightful a responsibility is to be a teacher. I guess everybody's got their least favorite verse in the Bible. My least favorite verse is the one, I think it's in James' epistles. He says to a congregation, brethren, do not many of you want to be teachers, because teachers will be judged more strictly.
It seems that we've, in some of your arguments, are discounting or disclaiming the fact of Jesus' divinity.
Why?
Well, I'm just saying, what about the argument of experience? David, Solomon, and William James's variety of religious experience. I'm sure many of us here have had close encounters with God. What about that experience? Or perception?
I don't quite understand the question.
The argument of perception or experience of God being here with us.
I think that's a very probable argument. If people who are wise and trustable in other ways claim to have had experiences of God, we ought to at least listen to them and follow them. Definitely. And even if you don't believe Jesus was divine, you've got to believe that he's a fool to be an atheist. Because there's nobody who made God more central to his whole life.
I actually think there are some very interesting objections to each of your points, but I'm not going to get into them since we don't have much time.
Take one.
Well, actually, I have a more overarching question that I'd like to ask. And that question is that I suppose one of the easiest responses to why the existence of God is not clear to everyone, why we would even have this conversation tonight, is, people's hearts are clouded by sin, they do not truly seek, and so forth. At least in my own experience, and many people I've known, I'm not convinced by that. I think that there are people who are truly seeking, that are truly open, but do not find God to be clearly present at all. So my question would be, why would God hide himself, so to speak? And why not make himself more clear? And more specifically, why faith as the big leap as opposed to love? Why not say, here I am, now choose to love me, as opposed to first decide whether I'm there or not?
That's an excellent question. C.S. Lewis wrote a whole book, his best book, I think, in answer to that question. It's a fictional novel called Till We Have Faces. I won't even begin to summarize it. It's a brilliant story. Your question is Bertrand Russell's question. On his deathbed, a preacher came to Russell and said, Bertie, you're going to die in a few days. You're a lifelong atheist. Suppose you find out that there is a God. What would you say to him? And Russell said, well, I suppose I should have to say, sir, evidently, you should call him sir, mark of respect and all of that. Sir, evidently you do exist, and my hypothesis of atheism was erroneous. Would you mind answering me one wee little question? Why didn't you give us more evidence? That's the philosopher's question. I used to think that was a very good question. And like you, I used to think that many people are searching for God but can't find him. And the explanation that sin has darkened the human heart was just too dark. When I was a Calvinist, I thought Calvinism was too dark. Now I think I have more of respect for Calvinism than I ever did as a Calvinist. Because I think as we get older, we know our own hearts a little better. And I think there's a lot of truth in that answer. In fact, I think that the reason God gives us so little light is that he sees that we need a lot of heart exercise. We need a lot of running after him. He plays hide and seek with us. He whispers in the ear and then runs away. Why? So that we run and run and run, and then when we finally find him, we find ourselves too, because we've developed the muscles. In other words, what he wants is lovers. He doesn't just want accurate philosophers who have the truth. He wants lovers. So even the greatest saints, especially the greatest saints, are in dark nights of the soul. They don't see God. They work by pure faith. In a sense, you have less certainty, not more, as you progress in the love of God, because he tests you more. Do you really love me? Lovers do not propose in syllogisms. Romeo didn't carry a battery of lawyers with him to Juliet to convince her that she had to marry him. So that's my psychological answer. I think he gives enough light so that those who truly love him will find him, but not so much light that those who don't want him will find him.
I'm not a quantum physicist by any stretch of the imagination, but what would you say to the person who takes the particular view of quantum physics, namely the idea of the wave-particle experiment and Schrödinger's cat? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Heisenberg's uncertainty principle?
Yes, and say that on the basis of that, at the heart of the universe, we do not find causality, which of course is the basis of reasoning, which is what we're doing.
Well, I'd first say that the causal argument doesn't talk about the microscopic world at all. It talks about the macroscopic world. Secondly, I'm not a physicist, so I have no authority on the subject whatsoever, but Einstein makes a lot of sense to me when he criticizes Heisenberg and says that that's got to be an epistemological limitation, not an ontological limitation. You cannot imagine something really having no determinate position or velocity once it's observed. If the act of observation, due to the finite speed of light, interferes physically with the object, it can be understood. But the mere consciousness of an object cannot possibly change the object, because then it's not the object of which you're conscious. It's a different one. So I think there's a logical self-contradiction built into that version of Heisenberg's principle. But I'm not sure whether that was Heisenberg's version. Ask John Polkinghorne.
Thank you very much.
Hi. You pointed out that New Agers are so deluded because they think they're God rather than admitting that we all yearn for God. And also pointed out that the central tenet of Christianity is that God came down to be one of us. But philosophically speaking, why is it okay for God to be man and not okay for man to be God?
Oh, I see who you are now. You are the Sibylline oracle. You are the inscription over the temple of Apollo, Gnothes Auton. Yes, a very good question. Not only is it not permitted for us to be God, but it is commanded for us to be God. The Eastern Orthodox call this theosis. It is our destiny. God will share his very life with us. We will become part of the family. The thing that I criticize in the New Age movement is not their ideal of a meeting of the divine and the human, but the means. Their means are human rather than divine. They don't depend upon divine grace. They depend on human effort.
Okay. Thank you.
Almost all of your arguments, they are based on the assumption that if there is a God, he is always a creator. What about a God who is not a creator?
How interesting. How old are you? That's a pagan idea. Am I speaking to an ancient Greek now? Frankly, I've never given that much of a thought. That's the first time anybody has ever asked me that question. If you mean a god like Zeus or Apollo or Poseidon or someone like that. Or if you mean God as some vague principle, like goodness, truth, and beauty, I wouldn't call that God. I'd call that an idea.
Thanks. I guess there's one particular argument about your argument from a desire which we never find completed, and I probably misunderstood the argument, but one objection would be that we do experience desires for all kinds of things which we find partially completed, but my desire for food is always greater than I should and often can actually satisfy. And other desires, such as for sex or for all kinds of pleasures, we actually can't satisfy completely or to the extent that we would like to. So we experience a lot of natural desires which are actually unable to be satisfied. So why should another one for happiness, for example, lead us to think that there is some further happiness which it does exist?
With the possible exception of sexual desire, and maybe the desire of the surfer for the perfect wave, I think every other desire can be satisfied temporarily. After you've had a delicious meal, you don't want to eat more at that time. Your hunger is not there anymore. It'll be there in 6 hours, but it's not there now. Sexual desire is different in that there's an ecstasy, a standing outside the self that's involved there that's not present in ordinary desires, like for food or even for human society. So there's something much more mystical about that.